Hi, I'm Rashay Williams. It's nice to meet you. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm doing really well. I'm excited to meet with you. So this is Rachel O'Connell. She's part of um, a really great organization we're excited to learn about today, Partnership for the Advancement and Immersion of Refugees. Is that right?
Yeah, or pair for short. It's kind of a
Partner
chunky
for short.
thing.
Okay, I like that smaller version. That's great. So I'm a volunteer right now for short SVR. It's Student Voices for Refugees, and specifically the University Alliance for Refugee and At-Risk Migrants, UARRM. So we're a coalition of students and professionals working to create a more accessible and welcoming higher education environment for students affected by forced migration. So over this last year, our organization has been working to launch a public education campaign, just like those different recordings that you saw, and the information that we sent you about, hoping to get a toolkit together and help members of the U.S. university community, from presidents to student leaders, expand higher education pathways for forcibly displaced students. So this is why I'm meeting with you today, to learn more about your organization and what you're doing in the United States to help this cause and to help the students in your area and other places to get access to those resources. So our hope is that on World Refugee Day, we can publish these resources as a toolkit and implement those and change and adapt those as time goes on to help more students have access. So that's just a brief introduction to what I'm here for. And I'm really excited to learn more about PAIR. Would you give a short introduction also about your organization? And then we'll head into those interview questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'm so happy to be here just because it is such a vital dialogue, and I don't think we've been having enough conversations about the specific demographic in accessing higher education. So I watched those videos. I was really excited and really excited that PAIR gets a platform and talking about things because we are a rather small nonprofit organization operating in Houston. So, our mission is to empower refugee youth to navigate American society, reach their academic potential, and then become leaders in their community. We have three different programs, so we do that through a variety of methods. I would say largely socio emotional learning, academic support, and then, of course, the College Access Program, which is the Global Scholars Program. I'm the program coordinator for that program. So, we work with juniors and seniors in accessing college opportunities and other post-secondary opportunities, which can look like careers and such. So
That's fascinating. That's really exciting. And I'm so glad to speak with you because your organization will be very valuable to include in our resources. And I hope that we can make a lot of students aware of what you're providing. So tell us about how your organization came to be. How did you get started? Who started it? And then how did you become involved with that?
Oh, absolutely. So it's a kind of exciting full circle because PAIR was first founded by a group of college students at Rice University in 2006 because they found that there were pretty significant economic and educational needs that weren't being met by refugee resettlement agencies. So, as you probably know, the resettlement agencies support adult acclimation to American societies that might look like some schooling, some ESL programs, English as a second language program, and then some career support. But there is a significant gap in the opportunities provided to youth, so children of refugees or younger refugees themselves that are under 18. So they developed this program. It was just a tutoring program at first, and it's expanded. So now it is an independent nonprofit, although we do have two chapters at Rice University and then University of Houston, where we
Oh,
recruit
great.
our tutors for our middle and high schoolers. So we have three programs, as I'd mentioned before. We have Global Learners and Global Leaders, which are after school enrichment programs. So we provide a variety of academic and socio-emotional support. So that could look like a few different topics on cultural diversity, identity and race, teamwork,
Oh,
health and
cool.
wellness. And then, of course, Global Scholars is college and career planning, which is specifically for our juniors and seniors. Gosh, what else? I would say that the programming is designed to help a variety of students because we do receive refugees that have been here for 10 years and then refugees that have been here for 1 year. So there are pretty diverse needs. So we provide a case management model. So Global Scholars works one-on-one with students in providing for their very specific needs.
That's really fascinating. And that, you're right. There is a gap there with those that come here as refugees or those that are born in the United States from parents who are refugees, who are trying to gain access to education. And a lot of what I have learned about recently as a part of SBR is that a lot of these students are really excited and capable. They just need help getting the resources and knowledge to be educated and learn about acclimating to the United States and becoming aware of what's around them. So that's really important and valuable what you're doing. So how do people find, how do you spread the word about your organization, and then who's eligible for that? What's the process of becoming aware of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we often receive rosters through the refugee resettlement agencies or schools. So we service refugee youth. So those specifically qualifying through UNHCR's definition, which is pretty narrow. There are very few that receive asylum status or are allowed to resettle here in the US. So we acknowledge that. And then we also serve special immigrant visa students. So those are SIV students that their families worked with the US government. These are largely Afghan families or Iraqi families that are resettled here. Students don't apply. We receive the roster, but often I think what's happened most recently, so we used to receive a roster from the school or from their resettlement agencies. That's YMCA or Catholic Charities here in Houston. They receive very large cohorts. I'm not sure if you're aware that Houston's the largest resettlement city in the US.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's
wow,
lots of students coming in each year, less so these past 4 years, but we're expecting a growth the next 4 years. But actually, our students have acted as the biggest recruiters, especially since the pandemic. We do home visits for our students, and sometimes we'll go there, and it's always a middle schooler. They'll run in and be like, there are new families, and then they'll take us to the door and introduce us, and we'll make sure that they're enrolled in school and then connect them with the resources that they need. So our students are definitely the biggest support system.
That's great. Good.
Yeah. Another thing is that, students that may not qualify as refugees, we sometimes have students that don't identify as refugees in our program. We can't support them with we have scholarship programs, and because those are grant funded, we can't always provide that for those students, unfortunately, just in the method of how nonprofit works here in the US. But we, they sit in our group programming, and that's often because they come in through the communities. So for example, we have Eritrean refugees, and in their community, there's Ethiopian students who are not technically refugees, but migrated for reasons that I would say should qualify, but do not. So they'll sit in on class and we get to know them, or, undocumented students. A lot of Spanish speaking students will come in and sit in our program, but they do not technically qualify as refugees. So it is a very community feel. We get to know them and their families pretty well. We often have, we call them pair families, because families have 8 or 9 kids. So we see the oldest one and then, go through the generations.
Oh, that's great. So it grows with the family, and then those families probably know people and bring them, like you said, and spread.
It definitely is a community program. And often our families are resettled in the same apartment complexes. So we go over there and then you'll hear someone go, "Pair lady." And so
she's here.
Yeah.
Well, and that's great that even those that you can't support financially can still participate in a lot of the aspects of your program.
Oh, absolutely. And I really wish we could support. There's just not that kind of resources available. And, this is something we can talk about later, but there is such a need beyond those that identify as refugees. But you're never going to mark against, it is such a community feeling. And I think that's really important to the values of our program, and the way that it functions is having the students at the center of it.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, and say, hey, we can help you in these kinds of ways. Even if we can't provide this for you, you're still welcome to come, and you're welcome here, and help the students feel like they belong. That's great.
Yeah. I will also add that the thing that makes my job so amazing is I help students, and then I find out that they helped other community members, and that makes me feel like it's really worth it. I helped this one student, and just the other day she told me she helped like 2 other folks do their taxes and apply for FAFSA and apply to college, and I was like, this is what makes it feel all worth it.
That's great. This is why I do what I do.
Yeah. And you need those moments. So
yeah, that's great. Yes, you do. And the good you're doing isn't just affecting the students you work with, but everyone they work with. And
empowering them to do it themselves and help others, I think, is really important. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So what would you say, you talked about this a little bit, but I want to hear a little more about the specific barriers that this population faces in gaining access or being successful in higher education. Sounds like you help more of those that are working towards higher education. So what are the barriers, maybe in that bracket first, and then what you see moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a college access program, but we do help with career exploration as well for those folks that maybe want to take a break or want to go into a technical program. Higher education can be a particular barrier for these students. And just thinking about headlines right now, I would say, first of all, racism and prejudice. I'll like go through all of these gaps in learning, significant gaps in learning, and then English language acquirement. The admissions process and the red tape of staying in college is very difficult for our students. Sometimes they get lost in the system. Lack of support programs and retention programs in colleges, financial stress, and then our students are often resettled into pretty underserved school systems. So from the get-go, I think that they have disadvantages as compared to other students that have more privilege here in the United States. So I guess I'll start with racism and prejudice. And I wanted to put this one first because, not to make it sound like I'm anarchical and want to dismantle the system, but sometimes I do. I think that the intersection of these identities makes it particularly difficult to access higher education, just because, in my opinion, higher ed institutions still operate on systems of whiteness and affluence. So our students have this intersection of identities that are, I would say, they come from a very high poverty index often. They're students of color. Some of our students are visibly Muslim, so they wear hijab. They're English language learners, they're immigrants, they're first generation students. Often, their parents haven't even finished elementary school. So there's pretty significant barriers. Their parents often do not speak English. So it's very difficult to navigate these systems that weren't designed to help diverse folks. So I would say that is a really pressing barrier in terms of the higher education program. And we see it in, I bring this up because it isn't only refugee youth. It's just that all these identities are poured into one for these students. So that can often be particularly difficult.
Yeah.
Another one, sorry, I'd mentioned gaps in learning. Often our students have significant learning gaps because there wasn't education access in their refugee camps. So they are missing significant just like information, and they have to catch up in high school. So just catching up to be college ready can be difficult. They learn so quickly. And, while they were in the camps, they were also working and doing all these things, and they're entrepreneurs, so intelligent. But, the way that we define college ready isn't necessarily making space for that kind of intelligence. English language learning is very, very pressing. Our students, some come in a year ago and they have to learn English. It's crazy how fast you can learn a language when your survival depends on it.
Yeah.
I was actually talking to a student from Côte d'Ivoire, and I'm embarrassed. I speak a few languages, and I learned French for 5 years. I could not have a conversation with her. I was like, I'm so sorry. And she learned English for 1 year. We had to decide on English. And I was like, I'm not supporting students the way I should, in terms of, she's so successful in learning English so fast, and I'm an embarrassment. I cannot speak to her. But, they just learn so quickly. But comparing it to, I'm sure you remember taking the SAT or ACT, is very difficult for native English speakers, especially if you're not provided those like classes to learn SAT words and such. Our students usually don't perform very well on those tests. It can be just such a barrier in terms of accessing four-year colleges. So yeah, I would say that's pretty pressing, just the admissions process of testing. There's so much testing here in Texas, especially. Also, I would say just like the red tape of applying and retaining in a college program can be really difficult. Sometimes our students do get lost in the system, especially if they are in a community college program. And, I'm saying students, I mean, those that aren't involved in pair as well. I'm just talking as like a broad
Just
demographic.
generally, yeah.
Yeah. So in community college, I'm such a believer in community college systems, but often there isn't enough support staff for the program itself to support higher needs students. What else did I mention? Financial barriers. This is something that is talked about pretty often in like the college access world, rising tuition costs and then lower financial aid. But I think it's also important to mention that the cost of foregoing a salary is really important in this space, because often our students, they're making an average of 30K for a family of 5+ children. So there is a need to support the family and pay for rent. Often, just anecdotally, when we supply scholarships, we have to pay it to the institution, but our students will be like, well, can we use this for rent? Like, can we use this for food? It's just, especially since coronavirus, when so many people are underemployed, there is like a very pressing immediate need, and solving these immediate needs is a higher education problem, I would say, because these students will either drop out or they're going to school while they're working full time just to put food on the table and support their families. They are very family oriented often, so they do feel a responsibility to help their families, but it is that investment in 4 years to make a better salary or work today minimum wage. So that is pretty difficult, and we try to focus on finances specifically in our program. I will say that these families receive rent relief for the first 6 months that they're resettled, and then for the first 5 years, they have some benefits, but I would say that the needs probably are more pressing than the support that is available. And the last thing was schools, underserved school systems, just by factor of being lower income, they are put into school districts that are underserved. So that means, most people receive free lunch. I think it's like 90% receive the free lunch program, which is an indicator of the income demographic of the area. There's often gang presences, fights. The student to teacher ratio is pretty poor. And then often the college counselors, there's only 2 for a class of 400. So even though they mean well, there's just not enough attention for the students to receive, especially if they have specific needs and need to be walked through, what is a college? What does a 4-year school look like? What does a 2-year school look like? What does that like tuition look like?
Yeah.
And applying for scholarships, because our program, we really don't encourage loans. None of our students take out loans, knock on wood, yet. We try to work specifically on grants and scholarships and get our students into college for free. Otherwise, it's too much of a financial burden. But that does require a lot of case management and one-on-one time, which the schools themselves cannot provide. And, these schools and these resources, they mean well, but when you have such a large cohort, you have 30 kids in your classroom that all have specific needs, how do you support each one of them? I think it's difficult. I know that was very long-winded. I hope that answered your question.
Perfect. That answered everything I was curious about. So I'm really glad.
I could talk about this for hours.
Oh, I'm so glad. I think those are extremely important to talk. These are issues that we're trying to work through and you're trying to work through. And that's what these organizations are for. That's why we're here. But it's so important to talk about the specific barriers. There are so many, and all of them are difficult. And many students struggle with not just one or two, but most of those issues all at once. And so that's why it's important for us to be here doing what we do. And it really does take an army, and it takes a lot of people working in and with these students at once, which is why less access to resources or having, like you said, one counselor for 400 students is important to know, so that we can provide the resources students need when they just don't have them where they are.
And I'll add here that, the biggest champions for their education are often the students themselves and their families. Their families support them so much, and they're so keen for their students to access higher education. So there is this interest and need. There's just not the right support on the other side.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. They want it very much, and they're very capable, and often for the population that I've worked with as well, the parents, because they haven't had the opportunity to have higher education, want it that much more for their children, and they work really hard to try and give access to that. So I'm curious, after hearing about the barriers and about where you are located and the resources you provide to specific places, are you looking to expand beyond Houston to different states, or to different high schools within your area, or what does the future look like?
That's very difficult for me to answer. I know that we see a need, and our organization has grown so much these past few years. I would love for us to expand, especially in the college retention aspect, because we are a college access program. We don't provide support officially to college students, and I see a very specific need there. To be determined if we will expand, but I would hope so.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it sounds like you are expanding. You're working in a couple different schools. You said the Rice.
Yeah, we have university partnerships. We have a few community partnerships here in Houston, which is really exciting. And then the schools we largely support in Southwest Houston, which is where most of the students are resettled.
Okay.
And I'm like pointing at it as if it's on a map. But we largely support 3 different school districts for high school, and then there's 4 for middle school. So, and it's expanded so much this past couple of years. I can only anticipate more growth. Hopefully, yeah.
That's always the hope, right? To get to more as possible. So that's great though. And to see, and just where you've started and where you are now, saying that it started as a tutoring program and now.
And that's, I think, the exciting part. It's just some students saw a need and they started advocating, which is so beautiful. And now we have really comprehensive programs with curriculum, where it once started as, let me help you with English and STEM classes. So, and we still have our Rice students. So that's a really long tradition that we've had. We recruit from Rice and University of Houston for our mentorship and tutoring programs, not for global scholars, but for global leaders and learners.
Okay.
So the Global Scholars Program is the college access part.
Okay, cool. And so this is kind of a follow-up question to the expansion question. And this is a question I feel that is often asked of nonprofits, just how to ensure sustainability in the long term. If there's a plan for that, or what that looks like for you. And that might also be a difficult question, but.
I know. I find that a little bit difficult, but I would say that we have a really good team right now, and our leadership, especially, our board members and then our executive director, work really hard to make sure that we have an equitable model in terms of staff not overworking, because in nonprofits in general, I just feel like there is a big burnout culture, because you're in this field because you care so much and you're so passionate about it, but having those separations of not overworking and making sure that you're providing resources to folks where you might not necessarily be the, like the best person for them, because we're in a case management model, our families will ask for tax advice or medical advice. They get papers and they need to read it. And there are other resources. So making sure that they have like this large support network, rather than completely relying on payer, which can sometimes feel a little bit difficult because you want to help them with everything, but making sure that the organization sticks to their mission as well. We also provide pretty constant professional development in order to stay on top of policy and trends, which is changing so rapidly, especially this past year in a good way. And then better enhancing the support that we give our students. I would also say that we try to keep our youth voice at the center of our dialogue and our mission, where students and alumni should have a vital space to let us know how they want program to expand. We often ask that in exit interviews and surveys. How would you see PAIR expanding here? Trying to get our alumni involved in volunteering as well, so that they have that leadership aspect is really important to our mission, just so that they are central. We're here to provide space for them to lead this field. So,
yeah. That's great. And so how do you so it sounds like the foundation of leadership and those involved in running the program is pretty solid. So what is I'm wondering also about financially, I suppose.
Looking for more grants?
Yeah, more grants, or is there a sustainable program that you're already working on for future sustainability?
Oh, yeah. So we continue to apply for grants, and there have become some that are more available because of the COVID-19 pandemic, addressing populations that were specifically affected by this pandemic more so than others.
Okay.
So we continue to apply for grants, but we have a pretty stable funding. I think we fundraise around like 500,000 a year, and
That's
that goes for
fabulous. Yeah.
programs. Houston also has a very giving nature, so that includes, programs and education and the government, but also includes individual donors that are interested in helping our students out or really believe in our mission. So I can only hope that expands. It's very difficult for me to add in our plans internally.
Right. For any grant, it's just the world we live in. But
yeah, absolutely. But I can only hope, I feel so blessed that we sustained ourselves over COVID and over these past 4 years, because there was a gutting of the refugee resettlement agencies, but we sustained ourselves, and we also kept in touch with all our students, which if you talk to other education programs, when we went remote, it was difficult to keep in touch with students that don't have phone plans or don't have Wi-Fi.
That would be.
That's, I think, like a particular, like we feel so proud that we sustained our program and are even expanding in light of these difficulties. So I know that didn't exactly answer your question. I kind of walked around it, but.
No, that's okay. It is a difficult question to answer. And we're mostly curious just to present, when we present this information, to know how your organization works and what it's doing to keep itself going in the long term, especially through a pandemic. That's really fabulous to hear that your organization is doing well and you're growing, and it's been really difficult.
We're sustaining through that, grow, which is an exciting place to be. It feels like a place of opportunity. So
that's great. And I'm curious now, maybe this would have been a question better for before, but to get more of a visual of how, you're working remote now, but before the remote work started, do you have a central location students come to for your program, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have an office location in the area that students can access, but we largely go to their schools. And we have the Paraleader after school program. Students come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we give them a free bus ride home, which I think captures a lot more students as well.
Yeah.
Right. They come through our program, and then we work with them individually at the schools as well. And then we also do home visits. So we work one-on-one with students in their homes. Obviously, that's changed since COVID. We moved largely online and faced some pretty significant barriers in reaching out to students and making sure that they engage online, because there was this gap. Students didn't know how to forward emails or use Gmail or use Zoom. And now they're pros because it's been a year now.
Yeah.
But it was pretty difficult. Also, just going to school and having younger children yelling, having to caretake, especially for the first girls in the family, for a variety of cultures, often have home obligations. So I've visited students, and they're just like cooking while going to school or working. A lot of our students were working at Amazon in the beginning, and we're like, you cannot be working while you're going to school. They thought they could get away with it. Yeah.
Busy. Wow.
Yeah, it's just, this demographic in particular had some trouble accessing the remote learning, but I think we found a good groove. We largely use Zoom. So we use Zoom every day. We switched our model. So students in the Leaders program have one-on-one tutors. Those are the college students. And that's helped because we'll get messages at 11 o'clock at night of like, can you help me with this physics homework? They're just getting homework. And so we had to change our model. And I think that's the beautiful thing about working at a smaller nonprofit is like, what is the need and how can we address it today? We're really flexible with moving around. And I think that is one of the advantages of working in a smaller organization. You see a need and immediately like, let's try this out. Let's do this. So we've supplied all our students with laptops, which is a huge game changer.
Yeah.
They do get laptops through their school, but just being teenagers, they don't always work or they break. So they did have those laptops. And then also we continued doing home visits. So that paused when Texas was in red alert for COVID. Right now, all our staff members are vaccinated. And which is so exciting.
That's awesome.
And we're really trying to spread the awareness of vaccinations in our client communities, just because there is a lot of misinformation out there. And once our students start getting vaccinated, they opened it up yesterday to all adults over 18.
Oh, great.
Which is so exciting. It's happening.
Super exciting. Yeah. We're getting back to a better place.
But we can start doing small group activities once students start getting vaccinated and do feel safe. So that's really, really exciting. But it has been a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of home visits, a lot of like, move your mouse over there. Like, okay, that's how you do it. So
Teaching,
with patience.
learning. That's great. So can students reach out to you anytime of day or night if they need help with something? Or do you have a specific list of resources you provide or tutoring?
Yeah. Often, I mean, I work in a case management model, but sometimes our students do have pressing needs of, I went to the doctor and they gave me this form and I don't know how to read it. Can you help me? Or,
Okay.
I have this English homework. Can you help me figure it out? And it's often just like one word that someone didn't explain well or something like that. So it often is pretty quick. Sometimes we will get messages pretty late because students have our cell phone numbers. Often they have our social medias because some students don't have cell phone plans. So, and we joke about it sometimes, I get messages on Instagram, on Facebook. Through our pair program, we have a pair Facebook and Instagram internally to talk to students. And recently, one of our staff members received a message on Pinterest.
Oh, wow.
Students had found her on Pinterest. I was like, why aren't you responding to me? And we try to like create some space where it's just like, if it is really late and I'm asleep, I probably won't respond. But
yeah, definitely.
I think the difference is, these students can't ask their parents for help. And often
right.
they're just so overloaded with work. There's just been so much homework and testing this past year, which has been really difficult for students, especially if they're not being instructed adequately on Zoom. There's not enough engagement. So I try to be as helpful as possible.
Keeping space, because that's important.
Right. That's like the other side. Sustaining is what we call it. So yeah, it's hard to say no, but if it's an emergency, I will respond. So yeah.
That's great. That's cool. And so it sounds like, I'm curious more of to get the picture in my mind of what this looks like. Do you have kind of one group of full-time staff that works and then volunteers that do more tutoring, or how can people get involved in that?
Oh, absolutely. So we have a program director of the high school program. So she oversees scholars and then leaders. Then I'm the full-time staff member. So I'm the program coordinator. And so I work with each student around like 3 hours a month in case management. So that's like the nitty-gritty of like applying for FAFSA and making them write essays, things like that. So we work very closely with them. We also have a part-time coordinator who supports in student outreach. We also have programs once a month. So we'll do group programming of how to build your resume. We recently did a vision board that was a lot of fun. Students were on for an extra hour and we just chatted about dreams and goals and how to achieve them. So we have this like group programming, individual case management. And then I think a really important aspect is our volunteers. We recruit volunteers from the community. So for the other two programs, we have college volunteers, but for the scholars program, we have community volunteers. So these are often folks that have graduated from college and are working full-time in the community in Houston that can often match with the students' interests and career. So these are like, that student's person. They do the emotional learning. They have a curriculum that they work through, but I think a lot of it is just like having that adult person that can help you navigate these difficult systems, do information interviews, like explore careers a little bit more and just have a friend. So.
Oh, that's great. And that's great to match someone up with the type of person they want to be and say, this is the job that I'm hoping to have and show me how to get there.
It's exciting just because then they get that experience and they actually learn what it's about. All our students want to be doctors and then they meet a doctor and they're like, oh, actually, maybe I'm interested in pharmacy. But having that actual like understanding and seeing that visibility, I think is particularly important. And our volunteers are so great and care so deeply about the students. So it's wonderful.
Cool. That's really cool. So how would you recommend when we share this information about your program, what can we tell the community to help them become more involved with you? Do we say to reach out to you, or how can they become involved?
So in Houston specifically, we recruit mentors. We specifically seek out mentors that align with that identity because that visibility is important to us. But we will take folks that are interested and passionate about youth development, about refugee resettlement, So that is one aspect to be involved. If you're not in the community area, we also often look for people that can meet the students in a group setting. So for example, we had a college professor who isn't necessarily in the Houston area, but was like, hey, I can help them with essay writing workshops. So we did like a Zoom workshop.
Cool.
So we try to be pretty flexible with volunteer engagement. It's just always wonderful to meet interesting and dynamic folks that care deeply and have resources to provide. So that's always exciting. In terms of broadly helping, I think awareness is pretty important. So understanding through community programs in an empowering way. So often a roadblock that we come into is our students qualify for a lot of scholarships, or opportunities, but they focus on the negative side of refugee identity, this like sad story and disempowered. But often I find these students are very empowered and have a lot to offer. So focusing on the positive aspects of what they overcame and how quickly they learned and where they're going and their hopes and dreams, I think is really important in a community space, like sharing that information, not only of the history of the migration issue, specifically right now in Syria and Ethiopia, we're seeing significant turbulence, but also what that aspect means, like what that identity means and how it's not an entire person, it's part of someone's identity. So I think creating that space as we continue to talk about diversity broadly, making space for immigrants and refugee identity and the complex intersection of that.
Yeah, I really like that. And I like that you mentioned the positive and the negative. There are a lot of difficulties from these stories, but a lot more positivity in how they've overcome the things they've had to work through. That's
and how they have a lot to offer because of that. You know, I've never met more with more grit and determination to succeed. So that's really awesome.
That's great. That's so great. So I'm looking at the last few questions, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. It looks like there's one in the chat as well. So what is one piece of your initiative that communities can do now and be involved with? It might be similar to the question about being involved with your organization as volunteers, but aside from volunteering, are there things the community can do to spread the word about your organization or more about refugees in general that you think is important?
Gosh, I guess plugging for my organization, we just developed a refugee voice platform on our website to share positive aspects. So Houston has a really rich history of refugee resettlement, going back to the Vietnam War, where we resettled a lot of Vietnamese communities here, and focusing on, now they're business leaders and things like that. So trying to focus on that, spreading that word. That was like my little plug. But broadly speaking, I think information, in general, information sharing and understanding the complicated nature of these global issues, and also maybe the United States involvement in some of them. But I think migration issues are especially coming up recently. There's large numbers of young people that are arriving at the Mexico border right now, and that's all over the news. So understanding the more complicated aspects of that is very important to destigmatize these identities and what's going on. I think it's especially important. I know that's very similar to the question before in the way that I answered it, but I just think awareness and understanding and research and stepping back and is very important for communities at large to create space and create equitable opportunity.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think that's really valuable information. So we've talked, about the community involvement aspect of it and volunteer work as well. What would you say is important for students to know for their peers who are also struggling or who are refugees or immigrants coming into the US? How can they be involved and help?
Oh gosh, welcoming, patience, understanding, seeking, learning. I think volunteer programs are often really beneficial for university students because you have as much to take as you have to give. You can learn so much in those programs. So I really advocate for any college students to, go out of your comfort zone and volunteer or learn more about a community, or maybe, go to different cultural events to understand the rich dynamics that our world has to offer and the beauty and diversity. Yeah,
that's great. And to be aware of people that are different than you. I like that.
And whatever that might look like, whether that means going to your local Hillel and having Shabbat with your friends, or, whatever that looks like to you, just going out of your comfort zone and learning new things.
I love that. I'd like to do more of that myself and be involved. And what do you think, just a step above that, university, because a lot of what we're hoping to offer would be to leadership of universities and schools who can have these resources to help their students become aware. So what do you think the leadership and university presidents can do to help advocate these resources and also promote access and welcoming campus environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I feel like programming works really well. It is hard to implement a program such as PAIR because you need staff, like full-time staff and curriculum. But I think that we've seen such positive benefits of that, and mentorship, just in terms of research and outcomes, has been really positive. So developing programs for support for a variety of students that have these identities, whether it's students of color, low income, English language learners, immigrants, first generation students, etc. So I think creating programming so that you can improve retention, because often what schools might report on is the admissions demographic of, we admitted X amount of students of color. Well, how many are graduating? How are you supporting them actively in your communities? I think that's a really good question we need to ask ourselves. In terms of the admission process, and this is pretty difficult to overcome. And this is something that we're seeing more pressing as we move on into 2021 and post-COVID, especially addressing the college admissions policies and the policies on campus that might be harmful for students that identify with these identities. So, I think the testing or essay writing, we need to find more equitable ways to support our students that might not only be a college program to support college students that have succeeded and gotten into higher education, but finding community outreach. Is it your responsibility as a university campus to create programming to help middle school students come on your campus and see this as a possibility for them? What are you doing in your community engagement to improve access and retention for students that aren't traditionally accepted onto your college campus? I think is an important question to begin asking yourself as leadership. Yeah, that's what I would say.
That's great. That's perfect. And I'm really glad that you bring up those points, because it's important for us to think about those things and for leadership to be aware of, like you said, not just those that are applying, but how successful are they when, like, in the process of going through school and graduating and moving on and retaining jobs, things like that after school's over. So then the question in the chat is, have you ever run into challenges with the FAFSA application? You mentioned helping students with their FAFSA and going through all the nitty-gritty of those different things. And in the case of students who can't get in touch with their parents for the sign-off, or how do you address those challenges?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good question, because this is a very difficult aspect of our job come around October. We try to work with families to educate them about FAFSA, because otherwise we're asking them for their social security number and their tax documents, and it's just not kosher. So talking through what college means and FAFSA, financial aid, scholarships, this is really important for us to communicate with our families. So that might look like printed resources, but more often sitting with the families, communicating with them either in English or like through the students who act as like kind of a liaison, just so that they are involved in the process, because this usually is a parent and student involvement. The parents are filling out the tax forms traditionally, like a FAFSA application. We run into quite a few challenges with the FAFSA because often our families might fill out their tax documents incorrectly. They just don't know, and they fill it out incorrectly, and this causes issues enrolling in FAFSA. For a lot of our African students, there is no marriage certification in their culture. It's like different, so it doesn't qualify as like a married couple. Sometimes they'll apply as separate, even though they live together, and split the children, which is not correct, and they don't know any better because it's just very difficult. I find trouble filling out my taxes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have issues every year.
Yeah, but this can create a lot of distress for our families if we fill out the FAFSA and those records don't match the tax records. That can just create a lot of issues. So we try to work earlier on spreading tax awareness with our freshmen and sophomores. There's also a resource here in the community, Baker Ripley, that helps families fill out their taxes correctly. And this is helpful for more complicated tax situations. So for example, if our refugee student has a baby and she's under 18, you fill that out separately. So working on those situations, I think it can get pretty difficult in terms of FAFSA.
Yeah.
Almost all our students get verified afterwards. So when you fill out the FAFSA, you send it off to college, even if it's correct. If you are lower income, you often will get verified just to check in that, what you put in as your family income is realistic. You send in copies of your tax forms or maybe your W-2s just to prove the fact that you are lower income because you're receiving more financial aid. So that can be another difficult transition. So I would say that this is an issue that we continue to face, but we try to spread awareness with the students and the families, because this is a particular issue for the students that graduate from Pair and do not have college support and still have to fill out the FAFSA. So sometimes these families will unofficially come to us and will help with the FAFSA, but it's not necessarily our role, and they don't have that college support to fill out the FAFSA because it is assumed on the family. So yeah, that's a really good question. It's very difficult, especially if the tax forms are filled out incorrectly. You have to send in addendums, and it can get messy. So.
Right. And do you find that you can usually work through those issues? Are there times where you just have to wait till the next year, or?
Oh gosh, I mean, we try to. We'll do everything we can. So we have professional development for like filling out the taxes and working on FAFSA, but sometimes it's possible that they have to wait a year, and that's just so traumatic because they don't have the same support. Often, if you take a gap year, you have a much lower chance of enrolling in college afterwards because you start working. Life comes up. We really try to avoid that as much as possible. But if you're not on anyone's tax forms and you don't exist, then like what can you do? So we try to work around that. But worst comes to worst, we haven't had the situation this year. We did have one situation last year where a student had to forego, and he did end up enrolling, which is awesome, but they had to wait a year. So yeah, that can be pretty awful. We try not to let that happen.
Yeah, well, that's good. And that's the hope. And it is an ongoing yearly issue. You have to do it all the time. So, but that's great that you can help help them getting started early, helping them understand taxes first. So there's less of a barrier when it's time to fill that out. And then it gets better as time goes on. They become more familiar with that.
Yeah, and they're redesigning the FAFSA. As of next year, they're including less questions. And
really?
Yeah, which is really
great.
This is like a very specific thing to be excited about. But in my world, it's like, yay. I think it's only going to be 36 questions. And they're also, because they ask, how much do you think your family will contribute? And for these families, it's $0. But it will actually put in negative money because you are putting money into transportation and food.
Exactly.
So they're actually calculating that into the FAFSA next year. Yeah, which is really exciting. So it won't make a difference for our juniors today, but later on in the future.
Absolutely. That is really good to hear. I did not know that. I'm really glad that you shared that. That's exciting.
Good things are happening.
Yeah, it's getting better. It's getting better. So that's all the question that I have for you. Do you have anything else that I didn't ask you about or that you wanted to share before we are finished today?
I don't think I do. I think maybe another emphasis on the fact that, our students are their own biggest advocates and their families, because I think that's kind of lost in this college access dialogue of if it wasn't for these families supporting them and working full-time jobs or multiple full-time jobs, these students wouldn't be able to access college. And that's pretty amazing and shouldn't be brushed off. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else, but this has been really fun.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. I've really enjoyed it. I've loved learning about your organization and all the good that you're doing. And I'm excited to share more and to share what you are doing with the community and with the people and partnerships that we have so that they can be aware of what you're doing also.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Rachel.